Earlier this spring, the United States Bureau of Reclamation flagged a critical operating signal at Lake Powell. Minimum probable inflow was projected at only 2.78 million acre-feet, 29% of the historical average, placing Glen Canyon Dam on a path toward 3,490 feet without major intervention. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. Reclamation began changing monthly releases to retain nearly 600,000 acre-feet. The agency warned that the reservoir could cross minimum power pool. The official protection target of 3,525 feet leaves only a 35-foot buffer, and upstream reservoirs are now being asked to send additional water toward Lake Powell. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is not simply that the reservoir is shrinking. The hidden number is the operating margin between the lake and the elevation, where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower normally, and its ability to release water becomes more restricted. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a dam margin failure. So the question is no longer simply whether Lake Powell will fall farther. The question is what happens when a narrowing margin reaches power customers, river communities, farms, tribal water systems, downstream reservoirs, and the operators responsible for moving water across the American Southwest. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this reservoir is not only showing drought, it is showing where system choices may disappear first. Before sunrise in the Colorado River Operations Room, the first warning does not appear as a photograph of exposed canyon walls. It appears as a line of projected elevations moving downward across a computer screen. The Bureau of Reclamation updates that line through its 24-month study, a rolling model that combines reservoir storage, expected runoff, scheduled releases, evaporation, water use, and operating rules. Each month, the study asks the same practical question in a slightly different way. Given what is known now, where will Lake Powell and Lake Mead be next month, next season, and next year? But in the spring of 2026, the answer became more difficult to treat as routine. Reclamation reported that the probable minimum inflow into Lake Powell for the water year had fallen to roughly 3 million acre-feet, close to 30% of the historical average. Under the most severe official scenario, Lake Powell could move below 3,490 feet, the minimum power pool elevation, before the end of the year. By itself, that projection was not a prophecy. It was one modeled path among several. But an operations room is not built to wait for certainty. It is built to notice when the consequences of being wrong become larger than the remaining room for correction. On another screen, operators could see the release schedule from Glen Canyon Dam. Water moving out of Lake Powell does not disappear from the river system. It travels through the Grand Canyon toward Lake Mead, supporting downstream deliveries, environmental flows, tribal communities, cities, farms, and legal obligations that connect 7 states and Mexico. Holding water back at Powell can protect the elevation behind Glen Canyon Dam, but that same action changes the amount and timing of water arriving downstream. Releasing more water supports Lake Mead and downstream commitments, but it also lowers Lake Powell faster. The dashboard is therefore not showing one reservoir with one problem. It is showing 2 major reservoirs connected by a narrow operational bargain. Protect one margin too aggressively, and pressure moves to the other side of the system. At the beginning of the water year, the planned release from Lake Powell was 7.48 million acre-feet. That number had been set using the operating rules in place and the information available months earlier. Then the runoff outlook deteriorated. Snow in the mountains had to survive wind, sunlight, warm temperatures, dry soils, and the long route into the river before it could become usable reservoir inflow. A snowpack percentage on a mountain map was not the same thing as water reaching Lake Powell. That difference became one of the first warning lights. The basin could hold snow and still deliver disappointing runoff. The soil could absorb part of the melt. Vegetation could use part of it. Warm, dry air could pull part of it back toward the atmosphere. What looked like stored water in winter could become missing water by late spring. By the time that loss appeared in the reservoir forecast, operators were already dealing with a calendar problem. Water decisions had been made. Hydropower schedules had been planned. Downstream users had prepared around expected releases. Environmental programs had built flow assumptions into their work. And the river itself was moving towards summer, when heat increases evaporation and demand. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. A weak runoff forecast could be called a hydrology problem. A declining reservoir could be called a storage problem. Reduced hydropower could be called an energy problem. Pressure on downstream releases could be called a legal or political problem. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The same missing water was beginning to appear in every column of the operating dashboard. Reclamation responded by changing the schedule. The agency announced measures designed to retain nearly 600,000 acre-feet in Lake Powell compared with the previous plan. In physical terms, that is an enormous volume. Enough to cover hundreds of thousands of acres with 1 foot of water. In operational terms, however, it was not a permanent solution. It was purchase distance. Every acre-foot retained behind the dam slightly increased the space between the reservoir and minimum power pool. Every month gained created another opportunity for updated forecasts, additional coordination, or a better runoff year. But time purchased from one part of the system must be accounted for somewhere else. Water not released immediately toward Lake Mead changes downstream storage. Water moved from Flaming Gorge, Navajo, or the Aspinall unit can support Lake Powell, but it reduces the protective storage held in those upstream reservoirs. This is why the map cannot be read like a simple sequence of blue shapes. These reservoirs are not spare containers waiting to be poured into one another without consequence. Each one serves communities, ecosystems, power systems, recreation economies, and its own operating rules. Moving water is not the same as creating water. By midday, another part of the T word becomes important. Glen Canyon Dam is not merely holding a lake, it is converting elevation into working capability. When Lake Powell is high, the weight of the water creates hydraulic head, the pressure that drives water through the penstocks and turbines. The power plant can generate electricity while passing water downstream. Operators can adjust output across the day, helping the electrical system respond as demand rises and falls. As the reservoir declines, that pressure weakens. The turbines do not suddenly stop at the first sign of low water, but their range becomes narrower and their efficiency declines. At 3,490 feet, routine hydropower production reaches its recognized lower limit. Below that level, the dam can still pass water, but the route changes. More responsibility shifts toward the river outlet works. 4 pipes built through the dam near its left side. Together, those outlets have a design capacity of about 15,000 cubic feet per second under favorable conditions. That sounds immense until it is compared with the number of functions being concentrated into them. They may have to carry water needed for downstream delivery while supporting river conditions below the dam, operating under lower pressure, and remaining reliable for an extended period. The strange detail is that the dam does not need to run out of water for this transition to occur. Lake Powell can still contain millions of acre-feet while losing access to one of its most important operating pathways. The reservoir may look vast from the shoreline. The machinery experiences it differently. Machinery does not see miles of water. It sees elevation, pressure, intake position, vibration, flow rate, and the number of available routes through concrete. That is why 3,525 feet appears repeatedly in planning documents. It is not the failure threshold, it is the protection target, 35 vertical feet above minimum power pool. Those 35 feet are supposed to provide room for forecast error and changing conditions, but they are not a wall, they are a margin, and a margin can be consumed gradually, long before the public notices a single dramatic moment. In the operations room, the warning lights now extend beyond the dam. Western Area Power Administration must consider what reduced hydropower means for customers receiving power from the Colorado River Storage Project. River managers must consider how modified releases affect Lake Mead. Biologists must watch water temperature, sediment, native fish habitat, and the movement of invasive species below the dam. Municipal systems near Lake Powell must protect their own intakes as the shoreline retreats. Farmers and water agencies hundreds of miles away must follow negotiations that can eventually alter delivery schedules. None of these systems has failed simply because a projection crossed a line on a chart. That distinction matters. A model is not an event, and a warning is not a collapse. But an official forecast becomes operationally important when it forces agencies to act before the forecast is certain. That is what makes this day abnormal. The system is no longer discussing low elevation as a distant theoretical case. It is changing releases, coordinating reservoirs, reinforcing outlet infrastructure, and preparing for conditions that were once treated as exceptional. The map shows a shrinking lake. The dashboard shows something more precise. It shows a river system using several of its protective tools at the same time. It shows upstream storage being considered for support. It shows downstream releases being revised. It shows hydropower margin narrowing. It shows one dry year arriving on top of more than 2 decades of stress. And it shows the operating calendar moving faster than the institutions responsible for rewriting the rules after 2026. The unresolved question is not whether managers can keep Lake Powell above one line during one difficult season. They may be able to do that. The larger question is how many times the system can purchase distance by moving water, reducing releases, and borrowing margin from somewhere else. Because the most important signal in the room is not any single red light. It is the fact that several lights now depend on the same limited volume of water. And to understand why that volume can change the function of an enormous dam, the next step is to examine what 3,490 feet actually means. 3,490 feet sounds like an enormous amount of water. It is roughly 1,064 meters above sea level, higher than many mountain towns and far above the river channel below Glen Canyon Dam. But that is the first trap hidden inside the number. 3,490 feet is not the depth of Lake Powell. It is the elevation of the reservoir surface measured against sea level. The bottom of the lake is not flat. The canyon beneath it rises, falls, narrows, branches, and plunges toward the dam. So when the surface reaches 3,490 feet, Lake Powell has not become empty. Millions of acre-feet may still remain inside the canyon. What changes is the dam's access to that water. The headline number is not measuring how much water exists. It is measuring which machines can still reach it. At full pool, Lake Powell stands near 3,700 feet. The difference between full pool and minimum power pool is about 210 vertical feet. That is close to the height of a 20-story building. Seen from the shoreline, that decline reveals vast bands of pale rock and old mineral stains. Seen from inside the dam, it removes pressure. Water stored high behind a dam carries potential energy. Gravity pulls it downward. The greater the vertical distance between the reservoir surface and the outlet below, the greater the hydraulic head pressing water through the system. At Glen Canyon Dam, that pressure drives water through large penstocks toward 8 generating units. The turbines spin. Generators convert that motion into electricity. The same movement passes water downstream. One volume of water is performing 2 jobs at once. It is meeting river obligations while producing power. But as the lake falls, the vertical column becomes shorter. The pressure declines. The turbines receive less force. They can still operate for a time, but not with the same range, efficiency, or output available at higher elevations. The number is not just reservoir elevation. It is the power plant being pulled out of position. At 3,700 feet, the 8 generating units have a combined physical capacity of roughly 1,320 megawatts. That does not mean the plant produces that amount at every moment. Actual output depends on releases, maintenance, river rules, demand, and reservoir conditions. But it shows what elevation makes possible. A megawatt is 1 million watts. 1,320 megawatts is enough instantaneous capacity to serve a very large regional load under the right conditions. More important, hydropower can respond quickly. Operators can raise or lower generation as demand changes, helping balance the grid when solar output drops, temperatures rise, or another generator unexpectedly goes offline. That flexibility is part of the value. When Lake Powell loses elevation, the system is not merely losing a quantity of electricity, it is losing a controllable tool. This is where an everyday comparison helps. Imagine a water tower serving a town. The tower does not need a motor to push every gallon through the pipes because gravity creates pressure. If the water level falls, homes may still receive water, but pressure weakens. Upper floors notice first. Fire hydrants become less capable. Pumps work differently. The tank is not empty, yet the system has already lost performance. Glen Canyon Dam operates on a far larger scale, but the principle is similar. The remaining water matters only through the pressure, pathways, and equipment available to move it. 3,490 feet is the point at which the normal hydropower pathway can no longer be relied upon. Below that level, the water surface approaches the lower operating limits of the turbine system. The dam does not suddenly become a solid wall. Water can still pass through other openings, but the system becomes simpler in the most dangerous sense of the word. It has fewer options. To understand the scale, compare 3,490 feet with dead pool near 3,370 feet. Dead pool is the elevation below which water can no longer pass through the dam by gravity, using the existing outlet structures. The vertical distance between minimum power pool and dead pool is about 120 feet. That sounds like a large reserve, but it is not a normal operating zone. It is a descending corridor in which release capacity becomes increasingly constrained. The lower the lake, the less pressure exists to force water through the available outlets. The reservoir still contains water, but the maximum rate at which the dam can deliver it downstream declines. This is why minimum power pool and dead pool must never be confused. Minimum power pool means normal hydropower generation is lost, and release flexibility is reduced. Dead pool means gravity can no longer move water through the dam's lowest existing release pathways. One is a functional threshold. The other is a physical endpoint. Between them lies a narrowing set of choices. The number also changes meaning because a vertical foot is not a fixed volume. Near one elevation, a 1-foot decline may represent a different amount of water than a 1-foot decline somewhere else. Lake Powell fills a complex canyon system, not a cylinder. Its surface spreads through side canyons, bays, channels, and narrowing walls. As elevation changes, the surface area changes with it. That means 35 feet of buffer above minimum power pool cannot be converted into one simple amount of time without knowing inflow, releases, evaporation, and the shape of the reservoir at those elevations. A foot is a measurement of height. The rate at which the lake crosses that foot depends on the water balance. During a strong runoff period, the reservoir may rise. During a weak runoff year with continued releases, it may fall quickly. During summer, heat can increase evaporation, while agricultural and municipal demand remains high. The line on the chart is therefore a moving outcome, not a countdown clock, but the seasonal timing makes the official projections more alarming. Reservoir managers normally expect snowmelt from the upper basin to strengthen inflow during spring and early summer. This is the period when the system is supposed to rebuild storage before the hottest months. When inflow is extremely weak during that recovery window, the reservoir enters summer without having regained much of the margin lost during winter. The season designed to refill the system becomes a season that merely slows the decline. That is an abnormal pattern. The number is not just water being lower than normal. It is the recovery calendar failing to restore position. Outside the dam, 3,490 feet appears in stages. Hydropower customers may see reduced allocations or higher costs as replacement electricity is purchased from other sources. Grid operators may have one less flexible generator available during periods of high demand. River managers may have less freedom to design releases around ecological goals. Maintenance crews may face greater dependence on equipment that was previously used as a secondary pathway. Downstream users may not immediately receive less water, but the methods available to deliver that water become more restricted. The threshold changes the system before it changes the legal entitlement written on paper. That difference is critical. A compact can specify an obligation. A court decision can define a right. A contract can promise a delivery. But concrete and gravity determine whether the infrastructure can move the water at the required rate. Law organizes the river. Physics carries it. And physics does not negotiate with the number on a spreadsheet. The most misleading image is therefore the exposed shoreline. It is dramatic, visible, and easy to understand, but it encourages the viewer to ask how much water is left. The more important question is how much operating capability is left. At 3,490 feet, the answer changes abruptly. The power plant moves from limited to unavailable for normal generation. Water that once passed through turbines must seek another route. A facility built to combine storage, delivery, and power begins losing one of those functions. The dam remains standing. The reservoir remains visible. The river continues flowing, yet the system has crossed into a different operating state. That is why this one elevation changes everything. It turns a shrinking lake into a machinery problem, an energy problem, a delivery problem, and a timing problem at the same moment. But even this threshold does not reveal the deepest risk. The real danger depends on how much distance remains before the threshold is reached, how quickly that distance is disappearing, and how accurately anyone can predict the next season. The headline is 3,490 feet. The hidden number is the margin above it. The most dangerous number at Lake Powell is not 3,490 feet. It is the distance between the reservoir and that line. A threshold can remain fixed for decades. The margin above it can disappear in a single season. That distinction changes how the entire warning must be understood. The public sees a reservoir elevation reported to the hundredth of a foot and naturally asks whether the lake is above or below minimum power pool. Operators must ask a harder question. How much uncertainty can still fit between the current elevation and the point where a major operating pathway is lost? That uncertainty includes snow that has not yet melted, runoff that may never reach the river, releases already scheduled, evaporation not yet measured, and weather that no forecast can describe perfectly months in advance. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. Under the Drought Response Operations Agreement, 3,525 feet is treated as the target elevation for Lake Powell. It sits 35 feet above minimum power pool. That 35-foot difference is not an extra reservoir placed on top of the critical line. It is response space. It is supposed to give managers enough distance to recognize a worsening forecast, coordinate among agencies and states, modify releases, and consider moving water from upstream Colorado River Storage Project reservoirs. The target does not guarantee safety. It marks the elevation where the system is expected to begin defending safety more aggressively. But that is not the strangest part. 35 feet can sound substantial when imagined as the height of a building. In reservoir operations, it can be smaller than it appears because the margin is exposed to several losses at once. Lake Powell must continue releasing water downstream. The reservoir continues losing water to evaporation. Inflow can fall below expectations. Summer heat can accelerate demand across the basin. A decision that preserves elevation during 1 month may be overtaken by weak hydrology during the next. The buffer is therefore not a wall separating normal conditions from failure. It is a moving balance sheet. Water enters one side, releases, evaporation, and other losses leave the other. The remaining elevation is what operators have left to work with. The shape of the canyon makes the margin even harder to read. Lake Powell does not store the same volume in every vertical foot. At some elevations, the reservoir spreads across wide bays and side canyons. At others, it is confined by narrower walls. This means the volume represented by 1 foot changes as the surface moves downward. 35 vertical feet cannot be translated into a universal number of days. During one inflow pattern, the lake might cross that distance slowly. During another, it could move much faster. A viewer looking at a stable elevation for several weeks might assume the danger has stopped. But that apparent stability may be temporary, created by the timing of releases or a brief pulse of runoff. The deeper trend can continue underneath it. This is why official projections are issued as scenarios rather than a single promised future. The most probable scenario describes one expected path. The probable minimum describes a much drier path. The probable maximum describes a wetter one. These are not competing guesses in which one must be declared correct immediately. They are operating boundaries. They show managers what the system may face if the next months arrive wetter or drier than expected. In June of 2026, the probable minimum study still projected Lake Powell above minimum power pool at the end of December, near 3,499 feet. That projection was less severe than the April warning that the reservoir could fall below 3,490 feet by August without intervention. The change matters. It shows that operations and updated hydrology can move the forecast. But it does not erase the warning. A projected elevation of roughly 3,499 feet would still leave less than 10 feet above minimum power pool. That is the hidden number. Not whether the threshold has already been crossed, but how little room remains if the next forecast moves in the wrong direction. Forecast uncertainty is often misunderstood as evidence that the danger is not real. In reservoir management, uncertainty can make the danger more important. When a system has hundreds of feet of operating room, an error of several feet may be absorbed. When the remaining margin is measured in single digits, the same error can change which outlets are available. The closer the reservoir moves toward the threshold, the less time operators have to distinguish a temporary fluctuation from a structural decline. Waiting for perfect certainty can become its own decision. By the time the data proves that the driest scenario is occurring, the water needed to respond may already be downstream. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a dam margin failure. The failure begins before the turbine intakes are lost. It begins when every operating choice must be judged against the possibility that there may not be enough elevation to reverse it later. Consider a monthly release decision. At higher reservoir levels, operators can release water according to established rules while retaining broad flexibility for the following months. Near minimum power pool, the same release carries a second cost. It reduces the remaining hydraulic margin. Water released today supports downstream storage and obligations, but it cannot be recalled if the runoff forecast weakens tomorrow. Water retained today protects Glen Canyon Dam, but it may increase pressure on Lake Mead and downstream users. Neither choice is free. The narrowing margin converts routine water movement into a sequence of trade-offs. The first people to feel this are not necessarily residents opening a dry faucet. They are the operators, power schedulers, maintenance crews, and river managers whose choices begin disappearing. A hydropower scheduler must prepare for less generation and less flexibility. A maintenance team must consider whether equipment can be taken offline when fewer release paths remain available. A downstream manager must calculate how reduced releases affect storage and delivery plans. An environmental program must determine whether flows designed for fish, sediment, and habitat can still fit inside a more restricted operating range. The public may still see water moving through the river. Inside the system, the number of ways to move it is already shrinking. There is another hidden margin inside the 35 feet. It is time. Physical actions across the Colorado River Basin do not happen instantly. Moving water from Flaming Gorge, Navajo Reservoir, or the Aspinall Unit requires analysis, consultation, legal authority, scheduling, and enough water in those reservoirs to make the action possible. Changing releases from Glen Canyon Dam affects Lake Mead and must be coordinated across a system governed by laws, agreements, environmental requirements, and international commitments. Reinforcing outlet works requires construction windows and crews. Power customers need time to obtain replacement electricity. A forecast may change in days. Institutions usually move more slowly. The operating margin is therefore measured in feet, acre-feet, and calendar pages at the same time. The danger is not only low water, It is low water arriving faster than the response process can move. That is why the target elevation exists above the physical threshold. 3,525 feet is intended to trigger action, while action can still matter. But when the reservoir remains below or near that target for an extended period, the emergency zone begins to feel normal. Protective measures that were designed for rare conditions become recurring tools. Water is retained. Upstream releases are considered. Hydropower planning is revised. Infrastructure is prepared for lower elevations. Each measure can reduce immediate risk. None creates new precipitation. The system can redistribute margin, but it cannot manufacture it. And every time margin is borrowed from another reservoir, another season, or another operating objective, the larger basin becomes more tightly connected to the next dry forecast. The headline asks whether Lake Powell will cross 3,490 feet. The real story is how close the system can approach that elevation while still claiming to possess meaningful flexibility. A lake 10 feet above minimum power pool is technically above the line. A lake 10 feet above the line after a weak runoff year, with high summer demand and uncertain winter snow, is not operating with the same security as a lake 50 feet above it. The threshold is binary. The risk is not. Risk rises as the distance narrows, because each error matters more, and each intervention has less time to work. The map shows water. The hidden number shows remaining choice. And when that choice becomes too small, the next stage is no longer about reservoir statistics. It is about the mechanism that carries declining elevation through steel, concrete, turbines, valves, power lines, and the river below. The mechanism begins hundreds of miles from Glen Canyon Dam, high in the mountains where winter storms place snow across the upper Colorado River basin. That snow is not yet river water. It is stored potential, a seasonal reservoir spread across forests, slopes, and alpine basins. For decades, the operating calendar has depended on part of that snow surviving long enough to melt during spring, enter streams, join the Colorado River, and eventually reach Lake Powell. But the path is not direct. Before the water reaches the reservoir, it must pass through air, soil, roots, tributaries, and a landscape that has become increasingly effective at taking part of it away. This is where the hidden mechanism begins. A mountain can receive snow while the river still receives too little water. The snowpack makes the headline. The conversion into runoff determines the damage. When spring warmth arrives, snow begins to melt. Some of that meltwater flows across saturated ground and enters streams quickly. But when soils are unusually dry, they behave less like a sealed surface and more like a sponge. Water that might once have moved toward the river is pulled into the ground. Plants use part of it. Some returns to the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. Warm air can increase those losses, and earlier melting can expose the land to sunlight for a longer part of the season. By the time the remaining water reaches Lake Powell, the volume can be far smaller than the winter snow map appeared to promise. The mechanism is often described as reduced runoff efficiency. In simple terms, the basin must receive more snow or rain than before to deliver the same amount of water to the reservoir. The landscape is keeping a larger share. That change matters because Lake Powell does not respond to snow percentages. It responds to actual inflow. A reservoir rises only when water entering it exceeds water, leaving through releases, evaporation, and other losses. During a strong spring, inflow can rebuild storage. During a weak spring, the lake may rise only slightly. During an extremely poor year, the expected recovery season may fail almost entirely. The water does not need to disappear in one dramatic event. It can vanish through thousands of small withdrawals across an enormous watershed, a little more absorbed by soil, a little more used by vegetation, a little more lost to warm, dry air, a little less delivered by each tributary. By the time those losses combine at Lake Powell, they become a missing vertical margin behind one of the largest dams in the United States. Then the mechanism changes form. What began as snow and soil becomes hydraulic pressure. Water stored behind Glen Canyon Dam sits above the river below. Gravity pulls that mass downward, creating hydraulic head. 8 large penstocks carry water through the dam toward 8 turbines. The moving water turns the turbines, and the turbines drive generators with a total nameplate capacity of 1,320 megawatts. The water then exits into the Colorado River and continues downstream. At higher reservoir elevations, the system has strong pressure and broad operating range. Operators can move substantial amounts of water through the power plant while producing electricity. They can adjust generation to help match changes in demand. The dam is not simply a wall holding water. It is a controlled pathway that converts height into motion, motion into electricity, and electricity into stability for a regional power system. Falling water rewrites that physics. As Lake Powell declines, the vertical distance pushing water through the turbines becomes smaller. The pressure available to the machines falls. A turbine is designed to operate within a range of flows and hydraulic head. Outside that range, efficiency declines and operating conditions become less favorable. The generating units may produce less power from the same movement of water. Their ability to respond across a wide range can shrink. The plant does not wait until the lake reaches 3,490 feet to begin feeling the decline. The loss of performance develops on the way down. Minimum power pool marks the point where the existing hydropower pathway can no longer be used for normal generation. That threshold is dramatic because one of the dam's major functions is removed, but the mechanism has already been moving through the machinery for months or years. Lower water becomes lower pressure. Lower pressure becomes reduced generation. Reduced generation becomes less flexibility on the electrical grid and less revenue from the power plant. Reduced revenue can also matter because hydropower income supports parts of the wider Colorado River storage project, including environmental and operational programs. The event is visible outside. The load begins inside. Once the reservoir falls below minimum power pool, the water must take a different route. Instead of passing through the 8 turbine penstocks, releases become dependent on the river outlet works. These are 4 large pipes installed through the lower portion of the dam. Each is approximately 8 feet in diameter. Under suitable conditions, all 4 together can pass roughly 15,000 cubic feet of water per second. That is a powerful flow, enough to fill an Olympic swimming pool in only a few seconds. But scale can be misleading. The important comparison is not between the outlet flow and a household faucet. It is between the outlet works and the responsibilities that may suddenly depend on them. Under ordinary conditions, water can move through multiple generating units, giving operators several pathways and allowing maintenance or changes in flow to be distributed across the system. Below minimum power pool, 4 outlets inherit a much larger share of the mission. Water delivery, river flow, downstream reservoir support, and environmental requirements become more dependent on a smaller group of components. The dam has not lost all ability to release water. It has lost redundancy. Redundancy is one of the quiet foundations of infrastructure safety. A system is more resilient when one component can be taken offline without stopping the whole operation. 8 generating units provide multiple combinations of available equipment. 4 outlet tubes provide fewer. If one outlet requires inspection or repair, the remaining capacity becomes more important. If 2 are unavailable, the system narrows further. The weak point is not necessarily that any one pipe is known to be failing. The weak point is concentration. More obligations are being placed onto fewer usable pathways. This is why reclamation has been realigning and improving the river outlet works. The work is not evidence that the dam is about to collapse. It is evidence that the agency understands how important those pipes become at low reservoir elevations. The mechanism continues as the lake falls below 3,490 feet. Lower elevation means lower hydraulic head at the outlet works as well. Less pressure means less maximum discharge capacity. The outlets may be capable of passing approximately 15,000 cubic feet per second at favorable elevations, but that capacity does not remain fixed all the way down. As the water surface drops, gravity has less force available to drive water through the pipes. The deeper the reservoir moves into the zone between minimum power pool and dead pool, the more restricted the release system can become. The reservoir may still hold a vast volume of water, but the dam may be unable to move that water downstream at the rate demanded by operating plans. This is one of the most counterintuitive facts in the entire crisis. Water can exist and still become operationally unavailable. Imagine a large tank with an outlet placed above the bottom. Water below the outlet remains inside, but gravity cannot push it through that opening. Glen Canyon Dam is vastly more complex, yet the physical limit is similar. At approximately 3,370 feet, Lake Powell reaches dead pool. At that point, water entering the reservoir could continue moving through at roughly the rate it arrives, but the stored water below the usable outlets could no longer be released downstream by gravity through the existing system. The lake would not be dry. The storage function of the dam would be profoundly altered, but long before dead pool, the declining pressure could create operational constraints. A monthly release target is not only a volume on paper, it must be translated into a flow rate through real equipment. Water managers may be required to deliver millions of acre-feet over a year. To do that, the dam must sustain enough discharge across days and months. If low elevation reduces the flow that can pass through the outlets, the operating schedule may have to change. More water may need to be released during certain periods. Maintenance windows become harder to arrange. Environmental flow experiments may become less feasible. The ability to increase releases quickly in response to downstream needs becomes smaller. A legal obligation can remain unchanged, while the physical pathway for meeting it becomes less flexible. The mechanism also enters the river below the dam. Water released from different depths can carry different temperatures and qualities. Lake Powell normally stratifies, with warmer water nearer the surface and colder water deeper below. As the reservoir falls and release pathways change, the temperature and composition of water entering the Grand Canyon can change as well. That matters for fish, insects, algae, and the wider river ecosystem. Some native species evolved under highly variable natural conditions. Other species, including non-native fish, respond differently to warmer or colder releases. A change that begins as lost reservoir elevation can therefore move through an outlet pipe, into water temperature, into habitat, and into decisions about endangered species management. By the time the change becomes visible in fish populations or river conditions, the system may have been carrying the altered load for months. Then the mechanism reaches the electrical grid. Hydropower from Glen Canyon is valuable not only because it produces energy, but because operators can adjust it relatively quickly. Electricity supply and demand must remain balanced continuously. When demand rises in the evening or another generator stops unexpectedly, flexible resources help close the gap. Solar generation can fall rapidly as the sun sets. Wind can change. Thermal generators may take longer to increase output. Hydropower can often respond faster. Losing Glen Canyon generation does not mean the entire western grid goes dark. Other resources can replace the energy, but replacement can be more expensive, less flexible, or more carbon-intensive, depending on market conditions and what generation is available. The lost margin in the reservoir becomes a smaller margin in power planning. This is how a dry mountain basin can eventually influence a utility bill hundreds of miles away, from atmosphere into snow, from snow into soil, from soil into missing runoff, from missing runoff into Lake Powell, from Lake Powell into hydraulic head, from hydraulic head into turbines and outlet pipes, from those machines into electricity, river delivery, habitat, and public cost. At each step, the form of the problem changes, but the underlying deficit remains the same. Too little water reaches the system, and every component below must adapt to less pressure and fewer choices. The headline is a reservoir approaching a threshold. The mechanism is a chain of conversion losses moving through an entire region, and by the time that chain reaches a human life, it no longer feels like an elevation on a federal chart. It feels like a hotter home, a more expensive power contract, a difficult irrigation decision, a changed river, or a job that now depends on machinery operating closer to its limit. That is where the next part begins. Because infrastructure risk becomes real only when it passes through someone's day. A reservoir does not enter a human life as a number on a gauge. It enters through a decision. Consider a maintenance technician named Daniel, working for a small public power utility in western Colorado. Daniel is not standing beside Glen Canyon Dam. He is not watching Lake Powell fall. His day begins in a control building, where the river appears as scheduled megawatts, contract prices, maintenance requests, and warnings about available generation. Under normal conditions, hydropower from the Colorado River Storage Project helps utilities like his balance demand across the day. It can rise when homes begin using more electricity in the evening. It can help cover a sudden change in wind or solar output. It can respond when another generator becomes unavailable. But lower water at Lake Powell reduces the amount of power Glen Canyon Dam can produce and the range within which operators can adjust it. Daniel experiences that decline as a smaller block of dependable energy on his screen. The reservoir outside becomes a constraint inside the room. The first consequence is not darkness, it is replacement. Power that cannot be generated at Glen Canyon must be obtained somewhere else. That replacement may come from natural gas plants, other hydroelectric facilities, market purchases, batteries, or agreements with neighboring utilities. Each source has a different cost and a different level of flexibility. During mild conditions, the substitution may be manageable. During a heat wave, when air conditioners are running across several states, market prices can rise quickly. During an equipment failure elsewhere on the grid, the lost hydropower becomes more important. Daniel does not experience climate stress as an abstract trend. He experiences it as fewer options during the hour when the system needs options most. At home, the same mechanism reaches his family differently. His mother lives alone in a manufactured home outside town. The home heats rapidly during summer afternoons and cools slowly after sunset. She depends on an electric air conditioner that is older and less efficient than modern equipment. A higher utility bill does not immediately force the machine to stop, but it changes how she uses it. She may raise the thermostat. She may cool only one room. She may wait longer before turning it on. The body does not experience reservoir decline as a graph. It experiences it as heat that remains in the bedroom after dark. It experiences shallow sleep, dehydration, fatigue, and a heart working harder to move blood toward the skin. The chain has moved from mountain snow into soil, from soil into reduced runoff, from reduced runoff into lower hydropower, from lower hydropower into electricity costs, and from electricity costs into the temperature of work. Together, they create exposure. The danger is not only whether power exists, it is whether a household can afford to use enough of it during the hours when heat becomes medically dangerous. This is why system risk often reaches people through ordinary decisions rather than dramatic failure. A family skips cooling for part of the day. A utility delays equipment replacement. A town postpones upgrading a substation. A hospital pays more for electricity and cuts spending somewhere else. The reservoir does not need to cross minimum power pool for these pressures to begin. Reduced generation can matter while the lake remains above the threshold. The margin shrinks first in budgets, schedules, and operating plans. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside. Several hundred miles south, the same missing water follows another human pathway. Imagine Elena, whose family manages a small agricultural operation in central Arizona. The farm does not receive water directly from Lake Powell. Water must travel through the Colorado River system, pass Glen Canyon Dam, move through the Grand Canyon, reach Lake Mead, and then enter a network of canals, pumping plants, local districts, and farm deliveries. Every stage requires infrastructure and energy. The Central Arizona Project lifts Colorado River water uphill across long distances before it reaches communities and agricultural users. That movement depends on electricity. When water supplies tighten and energy costs rise at the same time, the pressure reaches a farm through both sides of its balance sheet. Elena sees it in the irrigation schedule. A smaller allocation may require fewer planted acres or a crop that uses less water. Higher pumping costs can make a marginal field unprofitable. A decision made months before harvest becomes a household income problem after harvest. Drought enters the planting window. The planting window enters employment. Employment enters rent, food, and medical care. Again, the mechanism is not one dramatic wave moving across the desert. It is a series of narrowing choices. Elena may fallow a field. A seasonal worker may receive fewer hours. A local supplier may sell less seed or fertilizer. A trucking company may move fewer loads. A school district may collect less local revenue. The river is carried through the community as money, work, and expectation. When less water moves through the system, the effects spread beyond the place where the water is physically used. This does not mean every reduced acre-foot can be traced to one lost job. That would be a false certainty. It means water scarcity increases the number of decisions in which someone must accept a smaller margin. The same pattern appears in tribal communities, but often under more severe conditions. Many tribes in the Colorado River Basin hold recognized water rights while lacking the pipelines, treatment plants, pumps, and funding needed to use the full amount legally available to them. A right on paper is not the same as water arriving at a home. When the larger river system becomes more constrained, communities already waiting for infrastructure can face another layer of delay and uncertainty. The mechanism enters through distance. A household may depend on hauled water. A livestock operation may rely on a well. A clinic may need secure supplies for sanitation and patient care. Lower basin storage does not automatically shut these systems down, but it reduces the flexibility available to solve existing shortages. The people with the smallest infrastructure margin can feel system stress before those with the largest legal or financial protection. This is one reason the phrase "people are affected" is too vague. People are affected differently depending on where they live, what equipment surrounds them, how much money they have, and whether the institutions serving them possess alternatives. A wealthy urban household may respond to higher electricity costs by paying the bill. An older resident in a poorly insulated home may respond by reducing cooling. A large agricultural operation may shift acreage or purchase water. A small producer may leave land unplanted. A city with multiple water sources may adjust its portfolio. A remote community with one vulnerable well may have no equivalent choice. The same reservoir decline moves through unequal systems and produces unequal risk. The human pathway also reaches workers at Glen Canyon Dam itself. Operators, electricians, mechanics, engineers, and divers must maintain equipment while the operating environment changes around them. At higher water levels, multiple generating units and outlets create options for moving flow while a component is inspected. Near minimum power pool, taking one pathway out of service can carry greater consequence because fewer alternatives remain. Maintenance becomes a scheduling problem under pressure. Work that would normally be routine may have to be performed during narrower windows. A valve, gate, coating, sensor, or electrical component becomes more important because more of the dam's mission depends on it. The worker does not experience reservoir decline only as concern about the lake. The worker experiences it as a smaller tolerance for error. Below the dam, river guides and communities connected to Grand Canyon tourism face another version of the pathway. Changes in release patterns can alter river levels, campsite access, navigation conditions, sediment movement, and the timing of flows. Ecologists may need to revise monitoring. Fishery managers may see water temperature changes that favor one species and harm another. Recreational businesses may need to adjust to unfamiliar river behavior. None of these consequences occurs in isolation. A change in dam operations can enter a boat schedule, a research budget, a seasonal job, or a local hotel reservation. Water is not only consumed, it organizes time. That may be the most important human mechanism of all. Reservoir storage allows society to move water across seasons. Snow falls in winter. Runoff arrives in spring. Farms, cities, and power systems need water during summer and beyond. A large reservoir converts an uneven natural cycle into a more predictable human calendar. When storage and operating margins shrink, that calendar becomes less dependable. Decisions must be made earlier, with less certainty. A farmer must choose what to plant before final runoff is known. A utility must secure power before the hottest day arrives. A family must budget for a bill before knowing how long the heat will last. A tribal water project must compete for funding while construction costs rise. The river enters each life as uncertainty about the next step, but uncertainty is not the same as helplessness. Utilities can diversify power supplies. Homes can be weatherized. Cooling assistance can protect vulnerable residents. Water systems can reduce losses. Agricultural programs can support conservation without placing the entire cost on individual farmers. Tribal infrastructure can be funded and completed. Dam equipment can be reinforced. Operating rules can be changed before the physical threshold forces a change. The purpose of following the mechanism through one person is not to claim that disaster is inevitable. It is to show where intervention can still interrupt the chain. The reservoir margin becomes human risk only through specific pathways, and specific pathways can be strengthened. Yet every intervention depends on recognizing the correct weak point. At Glen Canyon Dam, that weak point is not the entire concrete structure. It is the small group of release components that may be asked to carry a continental obligation when the turbines can no longer do so. The human story therefore leads back inside the dam, toward 4 steel-lined passages whose reliability could determine how much water the system can still move when the margin above 3,490 feet is gone. The weak point is not the whole dam. The weak point, they sit near the left abutment of Glen Canyon Dam, each approximately 96 inches in diameter, each controlled by a large gate and a hollow jet valve, each built to move water through concrete when the power plant is not carrying the full release. Together, the river outlet works can pass about 15,000 cubic feet per second under favorable conditions. In normal operations, that capacity is only one part of a much larger system. Water can move through 8 turbine penstocks. Releases can be distributed across generating units. Equipment can be rotated, inspected, or taken offline, while other pathways remain available. But as Lake Powell approaches 3,490 feet, the balance changes. The power plant loses hydraulic head. The turbine route becomes less dependable and eventually unavailable for normal generation. 4 outlets that usually support the operating system can become the operating system. That is the infrastructure weak point, not because the pipes are known to be collapsing, not because Glen Canyon Dam is about to fail structurally. The danger is that a small group of components may be asked to carry responsibilities designed for a dam with far more usable pathways. The river outlet works were constructed for specific purposes. They can augment releases through the power plant. They can help manage high-flow operations. They can provide a route for water when generating units are unavailable. For much of the dam's history, however, they have not been required to carry the entire long-term release mission alone. That distinction matters. Infrastructure can perform well during occasional use and still face different demands under continuous use. A backup generator may run perfectly during a short outage, but require different maintenance if it becomes the building's main power source for months. A hospital can open an overflow room during a temporary surge, but that room becomes a different system if it must operate every day. The outlet works face the same operational transformation. Equipment designed as one layer of redundancy becomes the primary path. And once that happens, every inspection, vibration, seal, coating, valve movement, and maintenance window matters more. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, the 4 outlets have a combined capacity of about 15,000 cubic feet per second. That number describes a maximum under particular hydraulic conditions. It is not a promise that the same capacity will remain available at every lower reservoir elevation. Flow through an outlet depends on pressure, and pressure depends on the height of water above it. As Lake Powell falls, the force pushing water through the pipes declines. Reclamation has already adopted interim operating guidance that reduces the assumed capacity of the outlet works when the reservoir is at or below 3,550 feet. That is 40 feet above minimum power pool. The system therefore begins treating the outlet pathway as constrained before the turbines are fully lost. The threshold on the chart is 3,490 feet. The operational caution begins higher. This is the kind of detail that changes the entire picture. A reservoir does not cross from safe to unsafe in a single vertical inch. Its machinery passes through a widening zone of limitations. First, hydropower output declines. Then flow assumptions are reduced. Then operating schedules must fit inside a narrower range. Then the number of components carrying the load becomes smaller. By the time the public sees a dramatic threshold, the system may have been adapting for years. The map shows one line. The machinery feels a slope. The small component at the center of that slope is the steel lining inside each outlet. Water moving rapidly through a pipe can damage surfaces over time, especially where coatings deteriorate or flow conditions create turbulence. Corrosion, erosion, cavitation, and mechanical wear do not need to produce a sudden rupture to become important. Small imperfections can increase maintenance needs. A damaged coating can expose metal. A roughened surface can alter flow. A valve that must operate more frequently may accumulate wear faster than one used occasionally. None of this means the outlets are presently unsafe. It means their condition becomes more consequential as alternative routes disappear. That is why reclamation began relining all 4 river outlets through an investment of nearly $9 million. The purpose was direct and operational. Preserve efficient, reliable water delivery. Relining a pipe inside a 700-foot dam is not cosmetic work. It is an attempt to protect the surface that carries high-velocity water through one of the last dependable low-elevation pathways. The project also reveals something larger. Agencies do not spend millions of dollars strengthening a secondary system unless they believe its role may become more important. The work is a physical acknowledgement that low reservoir conditions can persist long enough to change how the dam must function. But maintenance creates its own puzzle. To reline or inspect an outlet, that outlet may need to be taken out of service. When the power plant remains available, the system can absorb that loss more easily. When the reservoir is near minimum power pool, removing one of 4 outlets can reduce available release capacity by a meaningful share. If each pipe contributed equally, one unavailable outlet would remove roughly 1/4 of the total outlet pathway. Actual operations are more complex, but the principle is simple. The closer the system moves toward dependence on 4 components, the more expensive every unavailable component becomes. Maintenance must therefore be completed before the system needs the equipment most. That sounds obvious. It is also difficult. Reservoir decline does not follow a construction schedule. A contractor cannot order a wet year. Operators cannot pause evaporation while a valve is repaired. The project calendar and the hydrologic calendar move independently until low water forces them together. This is the infrastructure test. Can the dam strengthen its secondary pathway before that pathway becomes primary? Can work be sequenced without reducing release reliability during a dry period? Can spare parts, crews, inspections, and operating procedures be prepared for a role the outlets were not expected to carry continuously when the dam was designed? The answers depend on time, and time is the margin already disappearing. The next weak point lies downstream of the pipes. When water leaves the outlet works, it enters the Colorado River below the dam. The force, temperature, timing, and volume of that release shape conditions through Glen Canyon and the Grand Canyon. If outlet capacity becomes restricted, managers may have less freedom to vary flows. That can affect hydropower, but it can also affect beaches, sediment, fish habitat, recreation, and water temperature. Some environmental programs depend on carefully designed release patterns. High-flow experiments may move sediment and rebuild sandbars. Other flow patterns may support aquatic species or research objectives. Near low reservoir thresholds, those choices may be subordinated to the basic requirement of moving enough water downstream. The weak point then becomes a decision point. The same 4 pipes may be asked to support legal deliveries, protect downstream storage, maintain river conditions, and remain available for maintenance. Not every objective can always receive its preferred flow at the same time. When capacity is abundant, the system can negotiate among goals. When capacity is narrow, physics begins setting priorities. Lake Mead sits at the other end of this chain. Water released from Glen Canyon Dam travels downstream and becomes part of the storage available behind Hoover Dam. If Glen Canyon's release pathway becomes constrained, the consequence does not stop at the Grand Canyon. It enters lower basin planning. Cities in Arizona, Nevada, and California depend on Colorado River deliveries. Agricultural districts depend on them. Mexico receives water under international agreements. Again, crossing minimum power pool does not automatically cancel those deliveries. The danger is more operational. A smaller release range from Glen Canyon makes it harder to adjust the timing and volume of water sent toward Lake Mead. The system loses its ability to respond smoothly to changing conditions. A water obligation measured over a year may still be achievable, but the route to achieving it becomes less flexible and more dependent on uninterrupted equipment. This is how 4 pipes can carry a continental obligation. They are not carrying every gallon used across the Southwest directly. They are carrying the connection between 2 of the largest reservoirs in the country. That connection supports a sequence of agreements and expectations far larger than the steel itself. If the outlets remain reliable, water can continue moving even without hydropower. If their capacity falls, the problem expands beyond lost electricity. The river system begins losing control over timing, and timing is one of the main services a reservoir provides. Water may arrive naturally during spring runoff, while demand peaks later. Storage allows operators to delay the release. Gates and turbines allow them to control its rate. If low elevation restricts those controls, the dam becomes less able to shape the river around human schedules. The infrastructure still exists, but part of its purpose is weakened. There is also a financial pathway. Glen Canyon Hydropower produces revenue that supports repayment and operation within the Colorado River Storage Project. When generation declines, power customers may face higher replacement costs, and programs supported by power revenue can experience pressure. The outlet works can move water, but they cannot replace the lost value of water passing through turbines. The same acre-foot released through a power plant can contribute electricity and revenue while continuing downstream. The same acre-foot released through an outlet continues downstream without producing that hydropower. The water obligation may be met, but one of the system's economic functions disappears. A 4-pipe release system is therefore not an equivalent substitute for a functioning power plant. It is an emergency pathway preserving part of the mission while other benefits are lost. This is why the phrase minimum power pool can understate the danger. It sounds like an energy threshold. In reality, it marks the transition from a multi-purpose operating system toward a more limited delivery system. Above the line, the dam stores water, shapes releases, and produces hydropower through multiple generating units. Below the line, it can still release water, but with fewer routes, less pressure, reduced capacity, no normal generation, and tighter maintenance constraints. The concrete structure remains immense. The functional system becomes smaller. The danger is not only that one component could break, it is that the system has less ability to absorb an ordinary problem. A sensor can fail, a valve can require service, a coating can need repair, debris can interfere with equipment, an electrical control can malfunction. These are manageable events when redundancy is available. They become more serious when every remaining path is already carrying essential load. System failure often begins this way, not with one extraordinary catastrophe, but with an ordinary maintenance problem arriving after the margin that once contained it has disappeared. The weak point is not the whole system. The weak point is the small component that can no longer be bypassed. At Glen Canyon Dam, the 4 river outlets are approaching that role. Their existence is the reason water can still move below minimum power pool. Their limitation is the reason 3,490 feet changes more than electricity production, and their history points toward an uncomfortable lesson. Glen Canyon Dam has already experienced what happens when hydraulic equipment is pushed outside its familiar operating range. The direction of stress was different. The water level was rising, not falling. But the evidence left inside the spillway tunnels in 1983 showed how quickly a secondary pathway can become the center of an emergency. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. In 1983, Glen Canyon Dam was not threatened by too little water, it was threatened by too much. The direction was opposite, but the operational lesson was the same. A major piece of infrastructure was pushed outside the range in which its ordinary pathways could carry the load, and a secondary pathway suddenly became the center of the entire emergency. That year, Lake Powell rose to its highest recorded elevation, more than 3,708 feet above sea level. An unusually large runoff entered the reservoir after forecasts failed to capture how much water would arrive and how quickly it would arrive. The power plant and river outlet works could not pass enough water by themselves. Operators had to use the two spillway tunnels cut through the canyon walls on either side of the dam. Each tunnel was enormous, beginning at roughly 48 feet in diameter before narrowing farther downstream. Their purpose was simple. When inflow exceeded the release capacity of the power plant and lower outlets, the spillways provided another route around the dam. But a route that exists on a blueprint is not the same thing as a route proven under extreme, sustained load. Water accelerated into the tunnels at tremendous speed. The flow did not simply slide over the concrete. In places where pressure dropped rapidly, small vapor cavities formed inside the water. These cavities were temporary pockets, created when local pressure fell low enough for liquid water to become vapor. Then, as the water moved into a zone of higher pressure, the cavities collapsed. Each collapse was tiny. The force released against the concrete was not. This process is called cavitation. Imagine millions of microscopic impacts striking the same surface again and again. A single collapse is insignificant. A continuous field of them can tear material from concrete and steel. The damage does not begin as one cinematic explosion. It begins as roughness. Roughness disturbs the flow. Disturbed flow creates more low-pressure zones. More cavities form and collapse. The mechanism feeds itself. By early June, operators heard unusual vibrations from the left spillway and saw debris coming out of the tunnel. The water was carrying pieces of the structure with it. Inspection revealed severe erosion. In the left tunnel, cavitation had excavated a hole extending roughly 27 feet below the original tunnel floor. Concrete, reinforcing steel, and surrounding rock had been damaged. The spillway was still moving water, but the pathway designed to protect the dam was being consumed by the flow it had been opened to carry. This was not a cosmetic defect. Engineers feared that uncontrolled erosion could continue toward the dam or destabilize surrounding rock. Temporary measures were used while the reservoir remained dangerously high. Plywood flashboards were placed along the spillway gates to increase temporary storage. Releases were adjusted. Crews worked under pressure while runoff continued arriving. The crisis did not become a dam collapse, but that outcome was avoided through active intervention, emergency operations, and eventually major repairs. The lesson is not that Glen Canyon Dam nearly fails every time its operating range changes. The lesson is that hydraulic infrastructure can contain a hidden feedback. A pathway becomes necessary. The pathway is used harder than expected. Small damage alters the flow. Altered flow accelerates the damage. By the time the mechanism becomes visible outside the structure, the internal load may already be severe. After the flood, engineers repaired both spillway tunnels and installed aeration slots. These slots introduced air beneath the high-speed water. The layer of air helped prevent collapsing vapor cavities from striking the concrete surface with the same destructive force. The solution was based on a clearer understanding of the mechanism. Engineers did not simply add more concrete and hope, they changed the flow itself. That is why 1983 matters now. It shows that the strongest response begins by identifying the exact physical process, not by describing the entire dam as either safe or unsafe. In 1983, the hidden variable was cavitation inside spillway tunnels. Today, the hidden variable is operating margin above minimum power pool and the concentration of release responsibility into 4 river outlets. The similarity is not the amount of water. The similarity is the loss of familiar operating space. During the flood, the normal release pathways were insufficient, so spillways designed for exceptional conditions became essential. During extreme low water, the normal turbine pathways can become unavailable, so river outlets designed as supporting infrastructure become essential. High water moved the weak point upward into the spillways. Low water moves the weak point downward into the outlet works. The dam is being tested from the opposite direction. That distinction prevents a false comparison. The 1983 event does not prove that low reservoir elevations will cause cavitation damage in the river outlets, or that the same physical failure will repeat. The flows, pressures, structures, and operating conditions are different. Historical precedent should not be used as a prophecy. It should be used as evidence that secondary hydraulic pathways can become vulnerable when they carry a role larger or longer than originally expected. The event proves the general mechanism of operational displacement. When a system leaves its normal range, components that once provided backup can become critical infrastructure overnight. There is a second precedent, and it is closer to the current problem. In 2022, Lake Powell was already approaching elevations that threatened hydropower operations. Reclamation and the upper basin states activated drought response operations. The annual release from Glen Canyon Dam was reduced, and additional water was scheduled from Flaming Gorge Reservoir upstream. Together, those actions were expected to preserve approximately 1 million acre-feet of storage in Lake Powell, equivalent at the time to about 16 feet of reservoir elevation. That number is important because it turns emergency management into a visible exchange. 16 feet did not arrive from new rain. It was created by sending less water downstream and moving additional water out of another reservoir. The action protected Glen Canyon Dam's operating margin. It also revealed that the margin was no longer being maintained by Lake Powell's own inflow. The larger storage network had to support it. Flaming Gorge Reservoir sits on the Green River in Wyoming and Utah. Water released there takes time to travel through the river system before reaching Lake Powell. The reservoir supports hydropower, recreation, fish, local economies, and its own environmental obligations. Using it to protect Lake Powell is possible because the Colorado River Storage Project was built as an interconnected system. But interconnection is not infinite resilience. Water transferred from Flaming Gorge leaves less storage behind Flaming Gorge. The system can move risk. It cannot erase the basin-wide deficit. That is why drought response releases were designed as temporary protection, not a permanent operating model. A reservoir upstream cannot repeatedly sacrifice its own margin without eventually becoming constrained. The 2022 action also showed how fast a theoretical threshold could become a practical policy trigger. Minimum power pool had long existed in engineering documents. Then low water brought it into monthly planning, public announcements, environmental reviews, and interstate negotiations. The critical elevation stopped being an abstract line and began changing real releases. This is what a precedent does. It shows the moment when a scenario enters operations. By 2023, the broader Colorado River system was still operating under emergency concern. A strong snow year improved conditions and raised reservoir elevations, but one wet season did not restore the storage lost across more than 2 decades. Reclamation continued, developing temporary operating changes intended to protect Glen Canyon and Hoover Dam through the end of the existing guidelines in 2026. The strong runoff bought distance. It did not eliminate the mechanism. That distinction is central to understanding recovery failure. A wet year can increase elevation quickly. Rebuilding deep storage across Lake Powell and Lake Mead requires repeated favorable years or sustained reductions in use. If the system treats one good snow season as a return to the old baseline, it mistakes a temporary rise for structural recovery. Historical evidence from both high water and low water therefore points toward the same operational truth. Large reservoirs are most resilient when they retain multiple usable pathways and enough time to shift between them. In 1983, time nearly disappeared because inflow rose faster than forecasts and ordinary releases could handle. In 2022, time narrowed because reservoir elevation fell toward the point where ordinary hydropower releases could no longer be maintained. In both cases, managers relied on exceptional actions. In one, spillways carried floodwater, while crews fought cavitation. In the other, upstream storage and reduced downstream releases protected Lake Powell. The emergency tools worked, but successful emergency action can hide the fact that the system entered an emergency at all. There is a human tendency to remember the avoided disaster as proof that the system is stronger than it actually is. The dam did not fail in 1983, so the spillways can appear to have performed successfully. Lake Powell remained above minimum power pool in 2022, so drought response releases can appear to have solved the problem. A closer reading shows something else. The spillways suffered major damage and required redesign. The drought response action consumed storage elsewhere and brought temporary elevation. In both cases, the system survived by spending margin. One form of margin was physical, the remaining integrity of the spillway tunnels. The other was geographic, the water stored in upstream reservoirs. The outcome was not free. This is where the precedent becomes uncomfortable. Emergency tools are often designed around the assumption that emergencies are rare and separated by long recovery periods. A spillway can be repaired after an exceptional flood. An upstream reservoir can be refilled after an exceptional drought release. Maintenance can be scheduled. Budgets can recover. Staff can review the event and redesign the system. But what happens when the abnormal operating condition returns before the system has restored the margin spent during the previous one? That is not simply another emergency. It is a recovery failure. The danger is not only the peak stress. It is insufficient time between stresses. Glen Canyon Dam's history contains evidence that adaptation is possible. The aeration slots installed after 1983 were a direct engineering response to observed damage. Outlet relining and low elevation operating guidance represent the same approach today. Identify the pathway that will carry the load. Study how pressure and flow will change. Strengthen vulnerable surfaces. Adjust capacity assumptions. Prepare before the component becomes indispensable. These measures matter, and they should prevent the story from becoming fatalistic. Infrastructure is not frozen in the year it was built. It can be inspected, modified, and operated differently. But engineering adaptation has boundaries. An improved outlet can move water more reliably. It cannot create hydraulic head. A relined pipe can resist wear. It cannot refill Lake Powell. A revised release schedule can protect elevation temporarily. It cannot force snowmelt through dry soil and into the reservoir. The physical system can be made more durable while the water balance continues deteriorating. That is why the precedent must expand beyond the dam itself. The true comparison is not between one damaged spillway in 1983 and one low reservoir today. It is between two moments when the Colorado River system discovered that its historical operating range was not guaranteed. In the first moment, an unexpectedly large runoff forced the dam to use a pathway that had not been adequately protected against sustained high-velocity flow. In the second, prolonged aridity is forcing managers to prepare for a pathway that may have to carry releases without the power plant. Both moments expose the danger of designing around a middle range and treating the extremes as temporary. The difference is that the current extreme may not pass as quickly. A flood rises, peaks, and recedes. Long-term aridification can reduce inflow across years and decades. The system may not return automatically to the elevation around which its ordinary operations were built. That makes the modern weak point more than a maintenance problem. It is a baseline problem. 1983 showed what hydraulic stress can do to concrete when water arrives outside expectation. 2022 showed what drought response must do to neighboring reservoirs when water fails to arrive. 2026 is asking whether those emergency actions are becoming part of the regular operating calendar. And that question carries the story into a much larger system, because Glen Canyon Dam is not losing margin by itself. It sits inside a river network, built around assumptions about snow, demand, storage, law, power, and recovery that are all being tested at once. The Colorado River system was built to turn uncertainty into schedule. Snow would collect in the mountains, runoff would enter the river, reservoirs would store the surplus, dams would release water when cities, farms, power systems, and international agreements required it. The system did not eliminate drought, but it was designed to place distance between a dry season and a human emergency. Lake Powell and Lake Mead became the two largest pieces of that distance. Together, they allowed the river to carry water across years, not only across miles. But the pattern now emerging at Glen Canyon Dam reveals a deeper change. The reservoirs are no longer simply smoothing natural variability. They are being asked to absorb a long-running imbalance between the water the basin produces and the demands, promises, and infrastructure built around it. This is not only a reservoir decline, it is a calendar failure, an infrastructure test, and a compound risk signal occurring at the same time. The system was built around the assumption that a poor year would eventually be followed by enough better years to restore storage. That assumption is becoming less dependable. The Colorado River has always been variable. Tree ring records show that severe drought existed long before the modern dams were constructed. No single dry year proves that the climate has permanently changed, and no single wet year disproves a long-term decline. But the operating problem comes from the pattern across time. Since the beginning of this century, Lake Powell and Lake Mead have spent much of their history losing storage or recovering only part of what was lost. A strong runoff year can raise the reservoirs dramatically, as happened after the heavy mountain snow of 2023. Yet the rise may be followed by renewed decline before the system returns to the elevations around which its ordinary rules were designed. The danger is not simply drought, it is incomplete recovery repeated over time. A reservoir can survive a severe drawdown if it receives enough water afterward. A power system can survive a period of reduced hydropower if generation later returns. An upstream reservoir can support Lake Powell if it has time to refill. An emergency agreement can bridge a crisis if a permanent agreement replaces it before the next one. But when recovery remains partial, every new dry year begins from a lower starting point. The same climatic load produces a larger operational consequence because the buffer has already been spent. That is how an extreme becomes a baseline, not because every year looks identical, but because the system no longer returns consistently to the old middle range. The Bureau of Reclamation has acknowledged this uncertainty in the process for developing the rules that will govern Lake Powell and Lake Mead after 2026. The current interim guidelines were created to manage shortage, coordinate the two reservoirs, and define how releases and reductions would change at different elevations. Those guidelines provided structure during years of decline, but they were written before the basin experienced the full sequence of emergency conditions now shaping operations. The post-2026 process is examining alternatives that could govern the river for decades. Those alternatives differ in how they calculate releases, distribute shortages, protect infrastructure, account for storage in both reservoirs, and involve the upper basin, lower basin, tribes, and Mexico. The disagreement is not merely political. It reflects a physical question that has not yet been answered. How should a river be operated when the future flow cannot safely be assumed to resemble the 20th century record? Older water rules often begin with an expected quantity and then divide it. The emerging problem requires the system to begin with uncertainty. A rule may work under average conditions and fail under a sequence of low-flow years. A shortage formula may reduce demand, but react too slowly to protect critical elevations. A policy that protects Lake Powell can lower Lake Mead. A policy that supports Lake Mead can push Glen Canyon Dam closer to minimum power pool. The reservoirs are connected, but they do not share risk automatically or equally. Every decision changes the location, timing, or ownership of the remaining margin. This is why the new baseline cannot be defined by one reservoir elevation. It must be defined by how much total flexibility remains across the system. That flexibility includes stored water, reliable release capacity, conservation programs, power replacement, legal authority, funding, and time. A basin with moderate storage but strong conservation and clear operating rules may be more resilient than a basin with slightly higher storage but no agreement about what happens next. Physical water is the foundation. Institutional speed determines how effectively it can be protected. At Glen Canyon Dam, the physical calendar is moving in months. Snowpack develops during winter. Runoff forecasts change through spring. Releases lower the reservoir across summer and autumn. The legal calendar moves in years. Environmental reviews, interstate negotiations, tribal consultation, public comments, engineering studies, and federal decisions require time. That process is necessary because the consequences are enormous and distributed unevenly. But the river does not pause while the process continues. The weak point is therefore not only 4 outlet pipes, it is the gap between hydrologic speed and institutional speed. If the reservoir approaches minimum power pool before durable rules are in place, temporary emergency measures must carry the system again. Temporary measures can be effective. They can also become a substitute for resolving the underlying imbalance. The system has several ways to purchase time. It can reduce releases from Lake Powell. It can conserve water in the lower basin. It can move water from upstream reservoirs. It can pay users to reduce consumption. It can modify power operations. It can strengthen low-elevation infrastructure. Each tool protects a specific margin. None can protect every margin at once. Reducing Lake Powell releases may preserve hydropower elevation, while slowing the amount of water reaching Lake Mead. Releasing water from Flaming Gorge may protect Glen Canyon, while reducing storage in Wyoming and Utah. Agricultural conservation can preserve reservoir water while affecting farm income, workers, and rural communities. Urban conservation can reduce demand, but major savings often require investment in infrastructure, landscaping, pricing, and reuse. Hydropower replacement can keep electricity flowing while increasing financial cost. The river system can respond, but every response has a pathway through people. This is what turns reservoir decline into compound risk. Water, electricity, food, ecosystems, and public finance are often discussed as separate sectors. Glen Canyon Dam links them physically. Lower water reduces hydropower. Reduced hydropower can increase replacement costs. Higher costs can pressure utilities and customers. Changes in releases alter downstream storage. Storage conditions shape shortage decisions. Shortage decisions affect cities, tribes, farms, and Mexico. River temperature and flow changes affect species and recreation. Power revenue changes can affect programs tied to the Colorado River Storage Project. One missing volume of runoff can appear repeatedly across the system under different names. It can be called a megawatt deficit, an acre-foot shortage, a budget increase, a habitat change, or a lost planting opportunity. The labels change, the load does not. The system pattern also changes where risk appears first. The most visible crisis may occur at Lake Powell, but the earliest human damage may appear far away. It may appear in a household that cannot afford additional summer cooling. It may appear in a tribal community still waiting for water infrastructure. It may appear in a farm district deciding which fields will remain unplanted. It may appear in a power cooperative purchasing expensive replacement energy. It may appear in a small town whose recreation economy depends on reservoir access. It may appear in an environmental program that loses the release flexibility needed for a carefully timed flow. The first failure is not always where the water level is lowest. It is where the smallest social or financial margin meets the physical decline. That makes equality part of infrastructure resilience. A system can continue delivering water in total while exposing specific communities to disproportionate harm. An operating plan that protects reservoir elevation but ignores who pays for conservation may transfer risk rather than reduce it. A power plan that replaces Glen Canyon generation but raises costs for vulnerable customers may preserve the grid while weakening households. A water agreement that recognizes tribal rights without funding the infrastructure needed to use them may preserve legal language while leaving physical access unresolved. System resilience cannot be measured only by whether the dam continues releasing water. It must also be measured by who retains choices, as those releases become harder to sustain. There is another emerging pattern. The old preparation calendar separated hazards. Drought planning focused on water. Heat planning focused on health and electricity. Wildfire planning focused on fuel and evacuation. Agricultural planning focused on soil, irrigation, and markets. But these risks increasingly overlap. A weak runoff year can be followed by extreme summer heat. Heat raises electricity demand. At the same time, hydropower is reduced. Dry conditions can increase wildfire risk around transmission corridors and watersheds. Fires can damage landscapes, changing erosion and water quality when rain eventually arrives. Low reservoir levels can affect recreation revenue, while communities face higher infrastructure costs. The danger is not any one event. It is several loads arriving before the system recovers from the previous one. The danger is margin loss repeated across sectors. This is not just a drought, it is a recovery failure. And recovery failure changes the meaning of a good year. A wet winter may no longer represent restoration. It may represent one deposit against a much larger accumulated deficit. That does not make wet years irrelevant. Every additional acre-foot matters. Strong runoff can raise reservoir elevations, increase hydropower production, reduce immediate shortage pressure, and create time for policy. But the system cannot treat temporary improvement as permission to restore every old demand and expectation. If storage gained in 1 year is quickly consumed because operating rules assume the past has returned, the basin remains trapped in emergency cycles. The future baseline must include a different definition of success. Success cannot mean avoiding minimum power pool 1 year at a time. It must mean rebuilding enough margin that 1 weak forecast does not force extraordinary action. It must mean maintaining several usable release pathways, protecting both Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and reducing demand enough that reservoirs can recover during favorable periods. It must mean completing tribal water infrastructure, supporting communities affected by conservation, and ensuring that power replacement does not create a second crisis. It must mean using forecasts as ranges rather than promises. Most of all, it must mean accepting that storage is not surplus waiting to be consumed. Storage is the system's ability to survive being wrong. Glen Canyon Dam is exposing that principle with unusual clarity. At higher elevations, uncertainty is uncomfortable. Near 3,490 feet, uncertainty becomes operational load. A forecast error can remove hydropower. A delayed agreement can force emergency releases. A maintenance problem can reduce one of the remaining water pathways. A second dry year can consume the margin purchased during the first. The system is not failing because it lacks intelligence, engineering, or warning. It is being tested because its protective distance is shrinking faster than any single intervention can permanently restore it. That is the larger pattern behind the number. The American Southwest is not simply watching a reservoir move toward an engineering threshold. It is watching a century of water management confront a future in which the old calendar may no longer deliver recovery on schedule. The next rules will determine who conserves, who pays, which reservoir is protected, and how low the system is permitted to fall. But no rule can change the evidence line. It cannot claim certainty where forecasts remain uncertain. It cannot turn every low water consequence into proof of one cause. And it cannot honestly describe 3,490 feet as either an immediate apocalypse or a harmless technical mark. The final question is therefore not what story sounds most alarming. It is what the evidence actually supports, what it does not support, and what the warning still means when exaggeration is removed. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Glen Canyon Dam is not on the verge of collapsing because Lake Powell is approaching 3,490 feet. The concrete structure is not being described by federal engineers as an imminent structural failure. The reservoir will not become empty at that elevation. Cities across the southwest will not suddenly lose every delivery the moment the water surface crosses one line. And no single forecast can prove exactly where Lake Powell will stand months from now. Those claims would go beyond the evidence. They would also distract from the real danger, because the real danger is not a cinematic collapse. It is the steady removal of operating choices from a system that depends on having several choices available at once. What the evidence does support is more precise. 3,490 feet is the recognized minimum power pool elevation for Glen Canyon Dam. Near and below that level, normal hydropower generation becomes unavailable. Water releases must rely more heavily on the river outlet works. The pressure driving water through those outlets decreases as the reservoir falls. Release capacity becomes more constrained. Hydropower production declines before the threshold is crossed. Revenue, grid flexibility, environmental operations, maintenance planning, and downstream release options can all be affected before the lake reaches dead pool. These are not speculative consequences invented to create fear. They emerge directly from the way the dam is built and the way gravity moves water through it. The first evidence line is therefore between structural safety and functional loss. A dam can remain physically standing while losing part of the purpose for which it was built. Glen Canyon Dam can continue holding back Lake Powell while no longer producing normal hydropower. It can continue releasing water while having fewer available pathways and less control over the rate. The absence of collapse does not mean the absence of danger. Infrastructure often weakens functionally before it fails physically. A bridge may remain upright while weight limits reduce its usefulness. A hospital may remain open while staffing shortages reduce the care it can provide. A reservoir may still contain water while the dam can no longer move that water through its most valuable pathway. That is the condition 3,490 feet represents. The second evidence line separates minimum power pool from dead pool. These terms are often treated as though they describe the same moment. They do not. Minimum power pool is near 3,490 feet. Dead pool is much lower, near 3,370 feet. At minimum power pool, normal hydropower generation is lost, and release flexibility becomes more limited. At dead pool, water stored below the lowest usable gravity outlets can no longer be released downstream through the existing system. The difference is about 120 vertical feet, but that distance should not be mistaken for a safe operating reserve. It is a corridor of declining pressure and declining capacity. The lake does not move from normal operation directly to dead pool. It moves through a zone in which each lower foot can narrow what the dam is able to do. The third evidence line separates a forecast from an outcome. The Bureau of Reclamation publishes scenarios because runoff is uncertain. Snowpack can change. Soil moisture can absorb more or less meltwater. Spring temperatures can accelerate melting. Summer storms can add limited inflow. Releases can be modified. Conservation can change demand. A probable minimum projection is not a prediction that must occur. It is an official scenario showing what may happen under dry conditions. But the fact that the scenario is uncertain does not make it unimportant. Operators must respond to credible low-probability outcomes when the cost of waiting is the loss of a major operating function. A fire alarm does not prove that a building will burn. It proves that the possibility is serious enough to investigate before smoke becomes flame. The same principle applies here. A reservoir forecast becomes an operational warning when the system must act before the future is fully known. The fourth evidence line separates weather variability from long-term change. 1 week snow year does not by itself prove a permanent climate shift. 1 strong snow year does not erase the long decline in storage. The Colorado River has always moved through wet and dry periods. But research across the basin has shown that warming increases evaporation, dries soils, changes snowmelt timing, and can reduce the amount of runoff produced from the same precipitation. That means long-term warming can intensify the effects of drought without causing every individual dry year. It is accurate to say that aridification and rising temperatures are increasing pressure on the river system. It is not accurate to claim that every foot of reservoir decline can be assigned to one cause alone. Water use, operating rules, precipitation, temperature, soil conditions, and reservoir losses all interact. The warning becomes stronger when these factors are separated carefully, not when they are merged into one simple explanation. The fifth evidence line separates water law from water physics. Agreements, compacts, treaties, court decisions, and contracts determine how water is allocated and who is entitled to receive it. They are central to the river system. But they do not determine how much water falls as snow or how much pressure exists behind a dam. A legal delivery requirement can remain in force while the physical system becomes harder to operate. That does not mean the law becomes meaningless. It means the law must function inside physical limits. When those limits tighten, conflict becomes more likely because the promises remain larger than the available margin. The danger is not that one document suddenly stops the river. The danger is that several institutions can continue defending old expectations while the machinery carrying those expectations loses capacity. The sixth evidence line concerns causation. A higher electricity bill in one town cannot automatically be blamed on Lake Powell. Power prices are influenced by fuel costs, market demand, transmission constraints, weather, outages, regulations, and many other factors. A farmer planting fewer acres cannot automatically be traced to one reservoir projection. A fish population change cannot automatically be assigned to one release decision. These systems are complex, but complexity does not erase connection. Reduced Glen Canyon hydropower can contribute to higher replacement costs. Restricted releases can change river conditions. Lower storage can increase pressure on allocations and conservation programs. The responsible claim is not that every consequence comes from one cause. It is that declining reservoir margin adds load to systems already carrying other loads. This is compound risk. It is often invisible because no single event appears large enough to explain the outcome by itself. The final evidence line separates warning from inevitability. Lake Powell may remain above minimum power pool through operational changes, improved runoff, conservation, or a combination of factors. Outlet improvements can increase reliability. New rules can reduce the chance of reaching critical elevations. Power systems can replace lost generation. Communities can adapt. None of this means the danger should be dismissed. It means the future is still being shaped by decisions. A warning is useful only while there is time to change the outcome. The story began with an official line moving downward on a federal operations screen. That line did not show a collapsing dam. It showed a narrowing margin. It showed water managers retaining hundreds of thousands of acre-feet. It showed upstream reservoirs being considered as support. It showed releases being revised. It showed a protection target 35 feet above minimum power pool. And it showed how one fixed elevation can reorganize the behavior of an entire river system before the threshold is reached. The most important fact is not that Lake Powell contains less water than it once did. The most important fact is that the remaining water must perform more jobs with fewer available pathways. It must support hydropower, downstream deliveries, reservoir balance, river ecology, legal commitments, local economies, and emergency flexibility. As elevation falls, the water does not stop mattering. It matters more. Every acre-foot becomes attached to another decision. Every release protects something while weakening something else. Every delay spends part of the calendar. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a dam margin failure. The phrase does not mean the structure has failed. It means the margin that allows the dam to perform several functions safely and flexibly is being reduced. A system with margin can absorb forecast error, maintenance, drought, and disagreement. A system without margin must operate correctly every time. It must receive enough water. Its outlets must remain available. Its forecasts must be close. Its institutions must act quickly. Its power replacements must be affordable. Its downstream obligations must fit inside the physical capacity still available. The fewer margins remain, the more one ordinary problem can become an extraordinary crisis. That is why 3,490 feet changes everything. It changes the question from how much water is in Lake Powell to how many functions Glen Canyon Dam can still perform. It changes the conversation from scenery to machinery. It changes a drought story into an infrastructure story. It changes a reservoir elevation into a test of law, power, ecology, engineering, and public trust. And it changes the meaning of time. Above the threshold, time can still be used to adapt. Near the threshold, time becomes another resource being consumed. The event itself may pass. A stronger snow year may raise the lake. Emergency releases may preserve elevation. New agreements may reduce immediate pressure. But the thing revealed by this warning will remain. A system built around old assumptions is being tested by a river, no longer providing the same recovery on the same schedule. The future will not be decided only by the lowest elevation Lake Powell reaches. It will be decided by whether the basin can rebuild enough operating space that the next dry year does not begin where the previous emergency ended. The line on the screen will continue moving. Some months it will rise. Some months it will fall. The question is whether the system around it will continue treating every temporary improvement as proof that the old normal has returned, or whether it will recognize what the line has already shown. The danger is not only that Lake Powell may cross 3,490 feet. The danger is that the river system may reach that point after spending the last of the time it needed to change.